White widow sees black girl at husband's grave, breaks down after discovering the truth. The wind swept through the cemetery, whispering between the rows of gravestones like a quiet, mournful song. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of freshly turned earth, and the faint scent of rain lingered on the horizon, threatening, but never quite delivering. Beneath the overcast sky, the cemetery felt eerily still, as if time had stopped, or perhaps it was just Sarah who had stopped. She stood at the foot of the gravestone, her fingers lightly grazing the cool, smooth surface of the stone, as her eyes traced the familiar name etched into it, David Harper, her husband. Her heart ached with each glance, and tears welled in her eyes again, as they had so many times in the months since his passing. How could someone so full of life be gone so suddenly? How could the world just keep spinning while her entire universe had crumbled? Sarah had visited the grave so many times, each visit feeling like a little slice of torture, but she couldn't stop. She needed to be here. She needed to feel connected to him, even if only for a moment. Her breath hitched as she thought back to the good times, the laughter, the love. But now all that was left was this cold, silent stone. As she stood there, her mind lost in its swirl of memories and pain, something caught her eye, a flicker of movement just beyond the grave. A figure, young and unfamiliar. The hairs on the back of Sarah's neck stood on end. The woman was approaching David's grave, walking toward it with purpose. She was black, maybe in her early 20s, with a dark brown jacket, worn but dignified. Her presence was calm, but there was something undeniably intimate in the way she approached the grave. Sarah's chest tightened, her breath shallow. She felt an overwhelming sense of confusion. Why was this woman here? The stranger stopped in front of the gravestone, just inches from Sarah, and did something Sarah had never seen before. She placed her hand gently over the name engraved on the stone. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The gesture was too familiar, too personal. For a moment, everything seemed to slow. The birds stopped chirping. The wind died down. The world seemed to hold its breath. Sarah blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of the scene before her. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. Who was this woman? Was she? No, it couldn't be. Was she grieving for David too? A wave of emotion surged through Sarah, a mixture of anger, confusion, and heartache. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Could it be? Had David been hiding something from her? Someone else? She took a cautious step forward, the ground beneath her soft and uneven, as though she too was walking through a fog of confusion. Her voice was barely a whisper, carried only by the wind, as she called out, "Who are you? And why are you here?" The woman didn't flinch. She slowly turned towards Sarah, her eyes calm, almost serene, as though she had expected this moment. The silence between them stretched longer than it should have, the weight of the question hanging in the air like a storm cloud, ready to burst. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she stood there waiting for an answer. The world seemed to hold its breath, and with it, Sarah's entire being felt suspended in that moment. She had to know. The truth, whatever it was, had to come to light. This was not just a cemetery. This was not just a grave. This was the moment Sarah's world would tilt on its axis, and she would learn something that would change her life forever. As the seconds ticked by, Sarah felt the weight of her own vulnerability. The old wounds she had never healed, the questions she had never asked. With her voice trembling, she took another step closer to the woman. "Please," Sarah said, "tell me, what's your connection to my husband?" And just like that, the moment Sarah had been dreading had arrived. The truth would soon be uncovered. Before we dive deeper into Sarah's story, we'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Whether you've ever had a moment where everything changed in an instant, or if you've had a difficult truth reveal itself at the most unexpected time. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We have plenty more thought-provoking stories just like this one, where unexpected twists and powerful transformations will keep you on the edge of your seat. Your support helps us bring more emotional, heartwarming narratives to you each week. We're so glad you're here, and we can't wait to share the rest of this incredible journey with you. Now, let's get back to the story. Sarah Harper wasn't used to being alone. For most of her life, she had been surrounded by the noise of family, friends, and the constant rhythm of daily life. She had grown up in a bustling neighborhood, where the sound of children playing in the streets and the hum of car engines was ever present. But now there was silence, the kind of silence that enveloped her every morning when she woke up to an empty bed, and the kind of silence that had followed her through the days since her husband David had passed away. It wasn't that Sarah hadn't been strong. She had always been the kind of woman who carried the weight of others' burdens without hesitation. Whether it was helping a friend move, organizing charity events, or keeping the family's finances in check, Sarah was reliable, dependable, and calm. But the death of David had shattered her. It wasn't just the suddenness of it, though that had been part of it. It was the emptiness that now echoed through every part of her life. David had been her rock, her partner, her best friend. They had met in their early 20s at a friend's party, and from the moment their eyes locked, Sarah had known he was the one. He had that quiet confidence about him, the kind that made you feel safe, even when the world was falling apart. They had spent nearly 20 years together, 20 years of laughter, of shared dreams, of building a life that felt like it could last forever. But then, just as quickly as it had begun, it ended. David had passed away from a sudden heart attack while he was on a business trip. No warning, no signs, just gone. The grief had been overwhelming. She had found herself caught in an endless loop of disbelief and sorrow. How could the world go on when her world had come to such a tragic halt? She had thrown herself into work, into tasks, into the motions of everyday life, hoping that the numbness would eventually wear off. But it hadn't. Instead, it had settled deeper, a constant ache in her chest that she couldn't escape. It was only in moments like these, standing alone at his grave, that she allowed herself to truly feel the depth of that loss. The small suburban town where Sarah had spent her entire life was not a place that typically witnessed drama or scandal. It was the kind of place where people knew everyone else's business, but their lives were mostly uneventful. The streets were lined with neat houses, each yard perfectly manicured, and the local diner on the corner was always bustling with familiar faces. This town had always been a comfort, a place where things stayed the same, and where Sarah had built a life that had seemed so predictable, so secure. But since David's death, that security had felt like a lie. She had been holding on to the edges of her old life, unwilling to let go. But the world was shifting around her. leaving her behind in its wake. Sarah had tried to fill the emptiness by spending time in places that had once felt safe, like the diner, where she and David had spent countless hours over coffee, chatting about everything and nothing. It was a small, cozy place. Nothing fancy, just a gathering spot for locals. The worn red booths, the old jukebox in the corner, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee that always seemed to linger in the air made it feel like home. The regulars, the ones who had seen Sarah grow up, would often greet her with a sympathetic smile, and some would make small talk, asking if she was doing okay. But nothing felt okay as Sarah sat in the corner booth, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her coffee cup. She found herself staring out the window. The town outside looked the same. People walking down the street, children playing in the park, neighbors chatting over fences. But for Sarah, everything felt different now. The world had moved on, but she was still stuck in that moment, still living in the pain of losing David. She knew that part of her had to move forward. David would have wanted that for her, to live a life filled with joy and purpose, to not let grief consume her. But how could she? How could she let go of someone who had been such a vital part of her life? The questions lingered, unanswered, like the steam rising from a coffee. She wanted to believe that things would get easier with time, but with each passing day, the emptiness seemed to stretch farther and farther, consuming more and more of her soul. But it was at that very moment, as Sarah sat staring into her coffee cup, that something happened. The bell above the door of the diner jingled, and in walked a young woman, her features unfamiliar, but her presence unmistakably confident. She looked around the room briefly before her gaze landed on Sarah. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Something about this woman felt out of place. Yet there was something about her that Sarah couldn't quite pinpoint. She wasn't dressed like the usual diner customers. She wasn't in jeans or a sweater, like most of the locals. Instead, she wore a dark jacket, the kind of jacket someone would wear if they had come from somewhere far away. And there it was again, the inexplicable sense of familiarity. The young woman walked over to the counter, ordered something quickly, and then turned, as if by instinct, towards Sarah's booth. She hesitated for a moment before sitting down across from her, the suddenness of the move causing Sarah to feel an uncomfortable jolt. There was a sense of purpose in the air, a quiet intensity, and Sarah couldn't help but wonder, was this the start of something new? Or was it the beginning of a truth she hadn't been ready to face? As the woman smiled and introduced herself as Raven, Sarah felt an unsettling twinge in her chest. She had no idea that this moment, this chance encounter in the diner, would lead to the unraveling of everything she thought she knew. But it was too late to turn back now. The questions, the doubts, the buried truths, they were all about to surface, and Sarah was about to find herself caught in a storm of emotions that would shake her to her very core. Raven's unexpected appearance at Sarah's booth in the diner was more than just a moment of intrigue. It felt like a subtle unraveling of everything Sarah had carefully constructed since David's death. As Raven introduced herself, her eyes met Sarah's, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt a sense of urgency, as if something important had just shifted in the atmosphere. The quiet hum of conversation around them faded into the background, and for a few moments, all Sarah could focus on was the strange weight of Raven's presence. "Sorry to interrupt," Raven began, her voice soft yet confident, "but I think we need to talk." Sarah stared at her, unsure of how to respond. The diner was familiar, the smells of fresh pancakes and sizzling bacon drifting in the air, but the moment felt foreign, charged with an energy Sarah couldn't explain. "Talk? About what?" Sarah's voice was shaky, as though she could feel the tension that had settled between them, thick and heavy. Raven hesitated for a moment, glancing down at her hands, then back up at Sarah. "I know this is going to sound strange, but I think you knew my father." Sarah blinked, taken aback by the sudden revelation. "Your father? I don't think My name is Raven Mitchell," the woman said slowly, her gaze unwavering. "David Harper was my father." The world seemed to stop for a moment. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had heard of things like this happening, hidden secrets, buried pasts, but never in her wildest dreams had she expected to hear those words. Especially not here, in the place that had always felt so safe. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the words, the face that had suddenly appeared, the name that seemed to echo in her ears. "David, your father," Sarah repeated, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking it out loud might make it more real. "But that's impossible. He never mentioned you." Raven's eyes darkened with a mixture of sorrow and understanding. "I know he didn't. That's why I'm here. I've been looking for you, Mrs. Harper." The title stung in a way Sarah wasn't prepared for. She had always been Sarah, always David's wife, never a widow. She didn't know why Raven's words felt like a sudden jolt of electricity surging through her. The quietness of the diner now seemed to hum with an undercurrent of unease. "Wait," Sarah said, shaking her head, trying to gather her thoughts. "You said you're his daughter? How is that possible?" "David, he never said anything. He never mentioned a daughter, especially not one named Raven." Raven's lips pressed into a thin line. "He was a good man, Mrs. Harper. A good father, until he wasn't. There's a lot he kept from you. Things that might have seemed too painful to share. Or maybe things he thought you'd never understand. But I can't carry this secret anymore. I need you to know the truth." For a few seconds, Sarah simply stared at Raven, her mind spinning with disbelief. This couldn't be real. It didn't make sense. How could David, her husband of nearly 2 decades, have hidden something like this from her? Had their entire life together been a lie? The air between them grew thick with tension, and Sarah felt a sudden wave of nausea rise in her chest. She gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady herself, as if holding on to something solid might keep the ground from crumbling beneath her feet. "David couldn't have had a daughter without me knowing," Sarah said, the words spilling out in a rush, her voice trembling. "He loved me, Raven. He loved me, and we had a life together. You must be mistaken. I don't know why you're here, but I'm not mistaken," Raven interrupted, her voice steady, but her eyes full of pain. "I'm not here to tear apart your life. I'm here because I need to know the truth too. All these years, I've lived with the knowledge that my father had a secret. And now, with him gone, I have to find out what that secret was. Maybe you can help me understand. Maybe we can both find some peace." Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest, the blood rushing in her ears. The words didn't make sense, but the look in Raven's eyes, the desperation, the quiet plea for something more, It was all too real to ignore. And for the first time since David's death, Sarah realized that there had been things about her husband's life that she would never understand. "You're telling me," Sarah started, her voice raw with emotion. "You're telling me that my husband, my David, had a daughter, and he never told me. Not even once." Raven nodded slowly. "He was trying to protect you in his own way, but sometimes the things we try to protect others from only hurt them more." A heavy silence fell between them. Sarah's hands trembled, and she looked down at the coffee cup in front of her. How had she never known? How had David, the man she had built her entire life around, kept such a monumental secret? She had always prided herself on knowing him, on being the one person who knew his heart and mind, and yet here was this stranger, this woman, telling her things that shattered her very understanding of the life they had shared. "Why now?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why come to me now?" After all this time, Raven took a deep breath, as if steeling herself. "Because I found out about you only after my father passed. I didn't even know he had a family like yours, a life like yours. I didn't know he was married, much less that he had a wife who he clearly loved deeply. It wasn't until his things were being sorted after his death that I saw your name. I found your letters, your photos, and I realized that if I was ever going to understand who my father really was, I needed to talk to you." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. The silence between them now felt unbearable, a weight too heavy to lift. "Do you know what this means?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. "If everything you're saying is true, if David had a child, another life, then what does that say about everything we had? Was any of it real?" Raven's expression softened. Her eyes filled with empathy. "I don't want to hurt you, Sarah. I really don't. But the truth has a way of coming out whether we're ready for it or not. I just thought you deserved to know the truth about my father, and I need you to help me make sense of it all." The conflict was now undeniable. Sarah had always believed in the integrity of her marriage, the bond she and David had built together. But now, everything was in question. This revelation wasn't just about the loss of her husband. It was about the loss of the life she had built around that very marriage. Her world had been shattered, and now, with this woman sitting across from her, the pieces were being scattered even further. The silence that hung between Sarah and Raven was suffocating, almost tangible. It was as though the weight of the truth, a truth Sarah still couldn't quite wrap her mind around, had anchored them in place. The diner, once a place of comfort and routine, now felt like a cold foreign place where the rules had shifted. Raven's revelation had broken the familiar rhythm of Sarah's life, and nothing felt safe anymore. "Do you really think I can help you understand him?" Sarah finally asked, her voice a low murmur, struggling to find its place amid the turmoil brewing inside her. "You want me to explain a man I thought I knew? You want me to make sense of this secret he kept from me?" Her eyes were filled with disbelief as she stared at Raven, who hadn't flinched, but rather sat quietly, waiting. "I think you're the only one who might have the answers," Raven replied gently, her voice soft, yet unyielding. "I know he kept things from you, but he was also a man who loved you. The love he had for you, for your family, was real. But he had another side, one that he couldn't share. and I think he hoped you would never have to know." Sarah swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the table, as if holding on would anchor her in a reality that was slowly slipping away. She had always trusted David, but how could she have missed something so important? How could she not have seen the signs? "I don't know," Sarah whispered, shaking her head. "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know how I can even begin to look at you, at this, without feeling betrayed." Her words, though painful, were the truth, and they were raw. The betrayal stung deeper than she ever could have imagined. Raven didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned in slightly, her eyes searching Sarah's face for understanding. "It's not just about betrayal. It's about understanding why he made the choices he did. And maybe, just maybe, understanding him might help you heal from all of this." Her voice held a sincerity that for a moment caused Sarah to pause. Just as Sarah was about to respond, the door to the diner opened, and a figure stepped inside. The bell above the door jingled, and a man Sarah didn't recognize walked in. He was tall, with sharp features and a presence that commanded attention. His eyes swept across the room until they landed on their table. His gaze locked with Sarah's, and for a moment she felt an unsettling chill wash over her. The man approached their table, his footsteps steady but purposeful. Raven looked up at him with a brief flash of recognition before quickly looking back down at her hands. Sarah could sense a tension between them, a subtle, unspoken communication that only they understood. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think we need to talk." Raven stiffened, her body language instantly guarded. Sarah, however, felt her heart race. Who was this man, and why did he look so familiar? "Who are you?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky but firm. The man paused, then nodded slightly. "Name's Marcus. Marcus Lane," he said, his eyes now shifting from Sarah to Raven. "I think we have some things to discuss." "Marcus," Raven whispered under her breath, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. Sarah couldn't place it, but there was something about this man, something about the way he looked at Raven, that felt oddly familiar. "Raven, what's going on?" Sarah asked, her voice tight. But before Raven could respond, Marcus's attention shifted to Sarah. "You're Sarah Harper, right?" he asked, his tone more direct now. "I am," she replied, though her voice was thick with suspicion. What did this man want with her? And how did he know her name? Marcus took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You have no idea what you're about to uncover, but I need you to hear me out. This involves your husband, and it involves Raven." Sarah's pulse quickened. This was no ordinary meeting. The sudden arrival of Marcus, along with the cryptic words hanging in the air, felt like the storm that always preceded the truth. "Raven, do you know him?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with a mix of fear and confusion. Raven glanced at Marcus but didn't immediately speak. It was as if she was caught in an internal struggle, trying to decide how much of the truth she could reveal to Sarah. "Raven, please, what is going on?" Sarah demanded. She had to know the truth now. Every moment of hesitation felt like a century, and every second stretched longer than the last. Raven finally spoke, her voice trembling. "Marcus, he's the one who knows the rest of the story. He's the one who can explain why my father kept so many secrets, why he disappeared for years without any explanation, why he kept me hidden away from the world." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Raven wasn't just the daughter of her husband's past. She was a part of a deeper, darker story that Sarah had no idea existed. But why had David kept this from her? Why had he hidden his past so well? Marcus continued, his eyes darting between Sarah and Raven, his expression serious. David's death wasn't an accident, Sarah. It wasn't just some random act of fate. He was killed because of the things he kept from you, because of people he owed, people he betrayed. Sarah froze. The room seemed to tilt, and her breath caught in her throat. "What are you talking about?" she whispered. Marcus lowered his voice further. "David Harper was involved in things that you couldn't possibly have imagined. Raven's mother was a part of it, and so was I." The weight of his words hit Sarah like a freight train. The betrayal she had felt, the shock of Raven's revelation, all of it suddenly felt like child's play compared to what Marcus was now suggesting. Raven looked up at Sarah, her eyes filled with regret. "It's true," she said quietly. "My mother, she wasn't just anyone. She was involved in dangerous things, things that David promised to help her with. And when he tried to back out, things went wrong. That's why he disappeared. And that's why I had to grow up alone. He made choices that changed the course of our lives forever." Sarah's head spun. Her entire understanding of her husband, of their life together, was shattering before her eyes. What did this mean for her? And what did this mean for Raven? The secrets were mounting, and each one felt more dangerous than the last. "I didn't come here to hurt you, Sarah," Marcus said, his voice low but steady. "But you need to understand that this isn't just about your husband's past. It's about your future. It's about what's been hidden from you all these years." As Marcus's words lingered in the air, Sarah felt as if she were on the edge of something far darker than she had ever imagined. The twists were far from over, and the answers she desperately needed seemed to slip just beyond her reach. But one thing's becoming clear. Nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed the revelation about David's hidden past felt like an eternity to Sarah. Every morning, she awoke with the same heaviness in her chest, the weight of the truth pressing down on her with suffocating force. She had never imagined that her life, built on years of love and trust, could unravel so quickly. And yet, here she was, confronted with a version of her husband that seemed almost unrecognizable. Raven's confession had shattered the foundation of everything Sarah thought she knew. It was as if the past had come to life, showing its ugly face in ways she could no longer ignore. But even in the face of all this betrayal, something within Sarah refused to let go. She wasn't ready to succumb to despair, not yet. In the quiet hours of the morning, Sarah sat alone in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. Her thoughts were chaotic, swirling around the question of who David truly was and what he had kept from her for so long. But now, there was a new question looming in the back of her mind. How could she move forward? How could she heal from this, rebuild her life, and find peace when everything felt so broken? Her phone buzzed with a message from Raven, asking if they could meet. Sarah hadn't seen her since the diner, where Marcus had dropped the bombshell that had altered the course of their lives. There was still so much left unsaid between them, so much confusion. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way forward, a way to reconcile the past with the present. When Sarah arrived at the small park where they had agreed to meet, Raven was already sitting on a bench, her posture weary, her eyes distant. It was clear that the weight of their shared history had taken a toll on her too. But Sarah could see something else now. Raven was no longer just the girl caught in a web of secrets. She was starting to understand the truth of her own identity, to piece together the fragments of her past, and to find a sense of purpose. "Sarah, I know I can't undo what's been done," Raven said, her voice soft but determined as Sarah sat beside her. "I can't take back the pain I caused by revealing everything to you. But I need you to understand, I wasn't trying to hurt you. I wanted you to know the truth. And maybe, just maybe, if we face it together, we can both heal." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat, but she swallowed it back, nodding slowly. "I don't know if I can forgive David, Raven, and I don't know if I can forgive myself for not seeing what he was hiding. But I'm trying. I'm trying to figure out what this all means." Raven's eyes softened as she placed a hand on Sarah's. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. It's okay to be uncertain. But I think we can start fresh. We can't undo the past, but we can choose how to move forward. And you don't have to do it alone." For the first time since the truth had been uncovered, Sarah felt the weight on her chest begin to lift, just a little. There was something about Raven's words, something about the possibility of rebuilding, of starting over, that sparked a flicker of hope in her heart. Maybe she didn't have to carry this burden alone. As they sat together, talking about the future, Sarah realized that Raven's transformation had begun long before their conversation. She had spent so much time trapped in the shadow of her father's choices, unsure of who she truly was. But now she was taking ownership of her story. She wasn't just the daughter of a man who had kept secrets. She was a woman capable of forging her own path, of healing the wounds that had once seemed insurmountable. In that moment, Sarah understood something deeply. The pain they had both experienced didn't have to define them. They had the power to transform it into something that would shape their futures, something that could lead them to redemption. As the weeks passed, Sarah took small but steady steps toward her own transformation. She sought therapy, finally finding a safe space to unravel her feelings about David's secrets and her own sense of betrayal. She worked through the anger, the confusion, and the shame, slowly realizing that the pain didn't have to consume her. She could still choose to love, to trust, and to believe in the goodness that existed within her. Raven, too, found her own path toward redemption. She enrolled in college to pursue a degree in criminal justice, inspired by the need to understand the world she had grown up in. The darkness of her past had been a heavy burden, but now she was using it as a source of strength, determined to make a difference in a world that had once seemed so cruel. One evening, several months later, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by the comforting hum of the evening. She felt lighter than she had in a long time. The anger that once consumed her had been replaced with a quiet peace. David's secrets no longer had the power to control her life. She had learned to reclaim her sense of self, to let go of the past without losing the lessons it had taught her. She picked up her phone and sent a message to Raven. "I'm proud of you. You're doing great things. And I'm finally starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything will be okay." Raven replied almost immediately, "We've both come so far, and we're only just getting started." In that moment, Sarah realized that forgiveness wasn't about excusing the past. It was about freeing herself from its hold. She didn't need to understand everything about David's choices to move forward. She didn't need all the answers. What mattered now was that she had the strength to move past the betrayal and to live a life that was true to who she was, not defined by the choices of others. The transformation wasn't easy. It took time, patience, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. But in the end, Sarah found that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning from it, growing because of it, and choosing to live with purpose, no matter what had come before. And as she looked at the world around her, she realized that even in the wake of betrayal, there was still beauty to be found, still love to be shared, and still hope to be embraced. At first, Sarah had hesitated to lean on others. She had always prided herself on her independence, on handling her problems alone. She had spent so many years in a marriage that she thought was built on trust and partnership, only to find out that her husband had kept secrets from her. This betrayal made her wary of relying on anyone again. But over time, as the weight of the truth began to settle, Sarah realized that healing wasn't just an individual endeavor. It was something that required the support of others. Raven, once a stranger to Sarah, became a pivotal part of this journey. Though their initial meeting had been fraught with tension, the bond that formed between them was unlike anything Sarah had expected. Raven was no longer the person who had shattered her world with the truth. She became a friend, a confidant, and someone who understood the weight of secrets and the difficulty of confronting the past. Their late-night phone calls, their heart-to-heart talks, and even their shared silences became an unspoken agreement to heal together. But it wasn't just Raven who helped Sarah through this difficult time. There was a network of support, people who rallied behind her when she needed it the most. Sarah's best friend, Maria, had been her constant companion, offering comfort when Sarah was at her lowest. Maria had listened patiently as Sarah vented her anger, and she had also been there when Sarah needed someone to remind her of her worth. It was Maria who gently encouraged her to start attending therapy, to explore what had been broken within herself, not just within her marriage. And it was Maria who sat beside her during the hardest moments of forgiveness, holding her hand when Sarah faced the prospect of speaking to David again. Beyond the close-knit circle of friends, Sarah found that the larger community around her had also played a vital role in her healing. The local church she had attended for years became a sanctuary of peace, a place where she could gather her thoughts and gain strength from others. The members of the congregation offered their support without hesitation, providing not only spiritual guidance but also the simple act of showing up. Whether it was a kind word after a sermon or a hug shared in passing, the warmth of the community became a consistent source of solace. There was a quiet strength in these everyday interactions. Sometimes it was a neighbor offering to help with groceries, or a friend sending a thoughtful message at just the right moment. These small gestures were far more powerful than Sarah had realized, as they provided a sense of belonging, of connection that transcended her personal grief. She wasn't alone, and even when she thought she might be, there were always people around her who cared, who wanted to help her rebuild. And yet, the most surprising source of community came from an unlikely place: David's family. In the aftermath of his betrayal, Sarah had assumed that the bond she had shared with them would crumble, just as her marriage had. But instead, she found that they too had been affected by the secrets David had kept. His sister, Emily, reached out to Sarah one evening, tearfully apologizing for not recognizing the signs of trouble sooner. "I had no idea," Emily confessed, "but I want you to know that I'm here for you. We're here for you." It was Emily who suggested that Sarah and David try family counseling, and it was Emily who, along with other relatives, helped to facilitate a space where Sarah could address her feelings in the presence of those who had been complicit in David's actions, not out of malice, but out of ignorance. The family wasn't perfect. They had their own flaws, their own baggage, but the collective desire to make things right, to support Sarah's healing, was something that filled her with a sense of gratitude and possibility. Through these experiences, Sarah began to realize something profound: the importance of relationships and community support cannot be overstated. She had spent so much time in isolation, believing that she had to shoulder everything on her own. But the truth was, her healing had been a collective effort, a product of the love and care of those around her. It wasn't just about individual growth. It was about the power of human connection. Her journey mirrored that of so many others in the world, people who, in times of struggle, find that the love and encouragement of others can be a lifeline. Whether it's a community coming together to support an individual through personal hardship, or a group of people rallying around a common cause, human connection is the thread that weaves people together, creating a stronger whole. In the weeks that followed her conversations with David's family, Sarah began to understand how critical it was to allow others to help her. Healing wasn't a solitary pursuit. It was a collective one. It was in the vulnerability of opening herself up to others that she found the strength to rebuild. There was no shame in needing support. Rather, there was power in accepting it. And this lesson wasn't limited to Sarah alone. As Raven's life began to shift as well, she leaned into the sense of community she had always been disconnected from. Her decision to attend college was fueled not only by her desire to understand her past, but also by the collective support of friends, family, and even strangers who offered encouragement. When Raven faced self-doubt, there were people in her life who reminded her of her worth. And when she succeeded, the community celebrated her accomplishments as if they were their own. Raven's transformation was mirrored by Sarah's, as both women learned that they didn't have to navigate their paths in isolation. They were part of a much larger tapestry, a web of human connections that could support, uplift, and transform. The morning of the family meeting was heavy with unspoken words. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her fingers trembling slightly as she stirred her coffee, the steam rising in delicate spirals. She had spent days preparing herself for this moment, steeling her heart against the inevitable confrontation that would take place. Her mind flashed back to the betrayal, to the emptiness she had felt when she discovered David's infidelity, and to the lonely nights that followed as she tried to put the pieces of her life back together. But today was different. Today, Sarah was going to face her past and hopefully find a way to move forward, not just for her own sake, but for the sake of the future she was now beginning to imagine for herself. As the clock ticked closer to the scheduled meeting time, Sarah glanced at her phone. The message from David's sister Emily was short and simple. We're all here, whenever you're ready. A wave of anxiety swept over Sarah, but she held it at bay. She had come so far, and she wasn't about to let fear control her again. When she arrived at the family's house, she found Emily waiting by the door with a warm smile. "Come in," she said gently, leading Sarah into the living room. The atmosphere was heavy, but there was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air. David was seated across from his parents, his face tense, but with a hint of relief in his eyes, as if he had been waiting for this moment too. As Sarah took a seat, the room fell silent. No one spoke immediately. There was so much to say, so much unresolved between them all, yet the words felt too heavy to bear. Sarah's heart raced as she scanned the room, but she reminded herself of the strength she had found in the past weeks, the strength that had come not just from within, but from the support of those who truly cared for her. It was David who finally broke the silence, his voice soft but firm. "I know I've hurt you, Sarah," he began, his eyes fixed on the ground. "I've destroyed the trust we built, and for that, I am deeply sorry. I can't take back what I did, but I am committed to making things right, however long it takes. I owe you that much, at the very least." Sarah swallowed hard, the emotions welling up inside her, threatening to spill over. She had imagined this moment so many times, but hearing him say those words, truly say them, carried a weight she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about the apology, it was the raw honesty in his voice, the vulnerability that she hadn't seen before. For the first time, she saw not the man who had betrayed her, but the man who was trying to atone for his mistakes. Her voice caught in her throat as she looked at him, her heart torn between anger and something she couldn't quite place. "How could you do this to me, David? To us?" Her words came out sharp, her anger still raw. But there was an undercurrent of hurt, of confusion, that made them tremble. "I trusted you. I gave you everything I had, and you threw it all away." David's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know why I did it," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I thought I could escape my own pain, that I could feel something different. But I was wrong, Sarah. I see that now. I see what I've lost. And if you'll allow me to, I'll spend the rest of my life proving that I can be the man you thought I was. I'll never hurt you like that again." The room was quiet again, the weight of his confession settling like a cloud in the air. Sarah felt a knot tighten in her chest, the familiar ache of betrayal twisting in her stomach. But as she looked around the room, at the faces of his parents, his sister, and even the people she had grown to trust in the last few weeks, something shifted inside her. There was a part of her that wanted to let the past go, to believe that people could change, to allow herself the possibility of forgiveness. But there was also a part of her that feared being hurt again, a part of her that clung to the walls she had built around her heart. And then Emily, David's sister, spoke up. Her voice was gentle but steady. "Sarah, I know it's hard to trust again, but we're here for you, for whatever you need. We don't expect you to forgive him today or tomorrow, but we're all willing to do the work. If you can give us a chance, we'll be there every step of the way." Those words, spoken with such sincerity, were the final piece that Sarah needed to hear. She had felt so alone in her pain, so trapped in the echo of her heartbreak. But in this room, She realized that she wasn't alone anymore. Not truly. There were people who cared. People who were willing to help her rebuild, no matter how long it took. A tear slipped down Sarah's cheek as she looked at David. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," she said softly, her voice trembling. "But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to work through this together. But it has to be different. No more lies, no more secrets." David nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I understand. I'll do whatever it takes, whatever it takes." There was a long silence, and then Sarah finally allowed herself to breathe. In that moment, it wasn't just about David's apology or her decision to forgive him. It was about something much deeper, a realization that healing could come, not just from within, but from the love and support of those around her. It was about opening herself up to the possibility of change, even when the pain felt too great to bear. And as Sarah left the family's house that day, she didn't know what the future held. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. She was ready to begin again, not just with David, but with herself. She was ready to rebuild the trust she had lost, to find peace within the broken pieces of her life. Months had passed since that life-changing conversation, and Sarah found herself sitting on the same kitchen chair, the soft morning light streaming through the window as she sipped her coffee. The world outside was still the same, bustling with the energy of everyday life. But inside, everything had changed. Sarah had changed. Her relationship with David had been fragile at first, held together by a delicate thread of trust and hope. But slowly, over time, that thread had strengthened. Every day David showed up, not just physically, but emotionally. He had done the hard work, attending therapy sessions, making amends where he could, and always keeping his promises. He was no longer the man she had feared would break her heart again, but the man she had hoped he could be. Someone who recognized his mistakes and was determined to build a better future. The journey had been far from easy. There had been moments of doubt, times when Sarah questioned whether she was making the right choice. The scars from the betrayal still lingered, but they were no longer the driving force behind her actions. With each passing day, Sarah had learned to forgive, not just David, but herself as well. She had carried the weight of guilt and anger for so long, thinking she had somehow failed by not seeing the truth sooner. But now, she understood that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting or excusing the pain. It was about setting herself free. That freedom had allowed her to rediscover parts of herself that had been buried under the weight of grief and distrust. She had started painting again, something she hadn't done in years. She had taken walks through the neighborhood, reconnecting with the world around her in a way that felt new, yet familiar. She had found a sense of peace that she hadn't thought possible. David had kept his promise to be the partner she needed, and more. He had surprised her with small gestures, helping around the house, sending her thoughtful notes when she was having a rough day, and most importantly, showing up when she needed him most. His actions spoke louder than words ever could, and Sarah found herself believing in him again, piece by piece. Their relationship had become a partnership grounded in mutual respect and understanding. It wasn't perfect, and there were still challenges to face, but Sarah no longer felt like she was carrying the burden alone. They had learned to communicate in ways they never had before, to be vulnerable without fear of judgment. They had found a way to heal together. On this particular morning, as Sarah watched David playing with their daughter, Emma, in the backyard, she felt a warmth settle deep in her chest. Emma was growing into a kind and curious little girl, and Sarah couldn't help but smile at the joy on her face. She had often worried about how the past might shape her daughter's future. But now, she saw only hope. She saw the possibility of a life where love and trust could be rebuilt, even after the deepest wounds. David called out to Sarah, a playful tone in his voice. "Come join us, Mom. We need someone to cheer us on." Sarah laughed, setting her coffee mug down and walking out into the sunlit yard. Emma ran to her, throwing her arms around Sarah's legs, her little giggle infectious. Sarah bent down, hugging her tightly. It was moments like these, simple, pure, and filled with love, that made everything worth it. The past would always be a part of their story, but it no longer defined them. What mattered now was the present and the future they were creating, brick by brick. As Sarah joined them in the backyard, laughing and playing together, she realized that the healing process was ongoing. It wasn't a destination, but a journey, and it was one that they were walking side by side. With each new day, Sarah felt more and more confident that they had the strength to face whatever challenges might come their way. The road to redemption hadn't been easy, but it had brought them closer, not just as partners, but as individuals. They had learned to forgive, to trust, and to love in ways they never thought possible. The road ahead was still unknown, but Sarah knew one thing for sure. She was ready to face it, with David by her side, and with a heart open to new possibilities. What would you have done if you were in Sarah's shoes? Would you have been able to forgive, or would the past have been too hard to let go? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if this story inspired you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more emotional and thought-provoking stories like this one. Every week, we dive into real-life journeys of transformation, healing, and redemption. Your story matters, and together, we can continue sharing these powerful lessons. Thank you for being part of our community. Let's keep the conversation going.